April 1, 1988. Fort Wayne, Indiana. 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley was walking home from a friend's house, just 3 blocks from her own front door. It was Good Friday. Kids were buzzing about Easter, the air light with spring. April was shy, sweet, her blonde hair tied neatly back, a smile that lit her face. She never made it home. That night, panic gripped the Tinsley family. Parents and neighbors formed search parties. Police combed the streets. Flyers plastered walls. For 3 days, Fort Wayne was on edge. Families holding their children close, locking doors, looking over shoulders. On April 4th, a jogger discovered her body in a ditch along a rural road, about 20 miles away. April had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The innocence of a small Midwestern city was shattered. Investigators threw everything they had into the case. Detectives knocked on doors, interviewed neighbors, chased every lead. Witnesses described a man in a blue pickup truck circling the neighborhood the day April vanished. But no one could give a clear description. The truck seemed to dissolve into the fog of memory, and one by one, the tips grew cold. Then, 2 years later, came a twist that sent a chill straight through northern Indiana. In 1990, a farmer found something scrawled in childish crayon on the side of a weathered barn, not far from where April's body had been discovered. The words, uneven and jagged, read like a nightmare brought to life. I kill 8-year-old April M. Tinsley. I will kill again. The message ended with a taunt. Ha ha. It was the kind of cruelty that turned fear into pure horror. This wasn't just a confession. It was a promise. And the promise didn't fade. In the years that followed, the phantom intruded into daily life in the most intimate ways. Little girls in Fort Wayne would come home to find notes stuffed into their mailboxes, into their bicycles, into their toys. Sometimes the notes were short, mocking, claiming responsibility for April's murder. Other times, they contained graphic, sickening details of what he had done to her. Attached to some were used condoms, a grotesque reminder that the killer wasn't done. He was still alive, still watching, still hunting. Parents no longer let their children roam the sidewalks where April once skipped. The air of trust in Fort Wayne collapsed. A generation of children grew up with warnings whispered at the schoolyard fence. Don't walk alone, or he'll get you. The killer had turned an entire city into his hostage. For decades, the notes stopped and started like a cruel game, always enough to remind everyone that the shadow was still out there. Police had DNA evidence, but technology was too primitive to find a match. The case became legend, part ghost story, part living nightmare. And all the while, April's killer watched, waiting for the world to forget. The 90s bled into the 2000s and then into a new decade. The seasons changed, children grew up, and yet the shadow of April Tinsley's case remained. It lingered in the background of Fort Wayne like a scar that wouldn't fade. Detectives came and went, each one carrying the same thick case file, pages worn from years of handling, photos yellowing around the edges. Each officer entered with determination, believing they would be the one to finally crack it. But months would pass, then years, and still no answers. Hundreds of suspects were questioned. Men brought in, grilled under the hot light, their DNA tested against the evidence. Thousands of tips poured in from citizens who thought they saw something, heard something, remembered something. But every lead fizzled, every hope dissolved. April's killer had vanished as if swallowed whole by the earth. Meanwhile, in a locked evidence room, the killer's DNA, pulled from April's body and from the vile notes he left behind, sat sealed in envelopes and vials, a time capsule of evil, preserved and waiting. The science of the 90s wasn't strong enough to unlock its secrets. Even as technology improved through the early 2000s, the code of his identity remained unbroken. The weight of time pressed harder with every year. April's parents grew older, their grief calcified into something quieter, heavier. Detectives stared at the box labeled Tinsley with a mix of shame and desperation. And all the while, the community lived under an unbearable truth. The killer was still out there. Somewhere in the shadows, he was living a normal life, buying groceries, mowing his lawn, blending into the crowd. Was he the man behind you in the checkout line? the quiet neighbor across the street, a face you'd pass in the park without a second thought. Fort Wayne became a city haunted not only by what had happened to April, but by the invisible presence of a monster who had escaped justice for decades. And as the years slipped by, one question grew heavier, darker, impossible to shake. Would April's killer ever be caught, or had he buried his secret so deep that it would remain untouchable forever? Then, in 2018, a flicker of light pierced 3 decades of darkness. Investigators, desperate for answers, turned to a tool so new it felt almost futuristic: forensic genealogy. The same method that had just cracked open the case of the Golden State Killer, a predator thought untouchable, was now being aimed at the ghost-haunting Fort Wayne. Detectives uploaded the killer's DNA into a public genealogy database. What appeared on their screens wasn't a name, not yet, but threads. Distant relatives, cousins scattered across the country, strangers who shared bloodlines. It was like staring into a puzzle with thousands of jagged pieces, and somewhere within it, the shadow of April's killer was hiding. Slowly, painstakingly, investigators began to map it out. Family trees branched and intertwined, each connection narrowing the field. Night after night, detectives sat hunched over charts and computer screens, tracing lineages back through generations. The branches kept pointing toward one cluster of names. And finally, impossibly, the net tightened around a single man, John D. Miller, 59 years old, living quietly in Grable, Indiana, just a short drive from where April had been abducted all those years ago. The discovery chilled detectives. For 30 years, he had been right there, blending into the fabric of normal life. A recluse, barely noticed, hiding in plain sight. When police knocked on his door, Miller opened it calmly. No shock, no confusion. It was as if he had been expecting this moment. When asked why he thought the police were standing there, he looked them in the eyes and replied, cold and matter-of-fact, April Tinsley. The room seemed to freeze. After decades of searching, after countless suspects, tips, and dead ends, the killer had just named his victim without hesitation. DNA tests confirmed what investigators already knew in their bones. The profile from April's body, from the taunting letters, from the nightmare that had haunted a city for 30 years. It was all him. John D. Miller. At last, the mask had been ripped away. The monster who had stalked children, who had mocked police, who had terrorized an entire community, was just an aging man living quietly among them. 3 decades of silence shattered with a single name. Justice, though long delayed, had finally found its mark. In December 2018, John D. Miller finally faced judgment. In a stark courtroom, under the gaze of a community that had carried April's ghost for 3 long decades, he was sentenced to 80 years in prison, a punishment that ensured he would never walk free again. The frail-looking man admitted everything. No bravado, no denial, just a chilling calm, as though the secret he had buried for 30 years had finally rotted its way to the surface. For Fort Wayne, the moment was not one of celebration, but of release. The city exhaled for the first time in decades, but the air was heavy, not light. Parents who had once gripped their children tighter back in 1988 were now grandparents, some with tears streaking their faces in that courtroom. April's family had their answer, but answers are not the same as peace. No sentence, no confession, could rewind the clock and bring back their bright, shy 8-year-old girl with the gentle smile. Still, the case became something larger than itself. It was a story of grief stretched across generations, of detectives who refused to surrender to time, of families who carried scars that never healed. It was also a reminder of the chilling patience of evil, that a man capable of such horror could vanish into ordinary life, mowing his lawn, shopping for groceries, all while the community he had shattered tried to rebuild itself around him. But there was another meaning too, one that rippled far beyond Fort Wayne. April's case stood as proof that the past could not remain buried forever. Forensic genealogy had reached into the darkness of 1988, pulled out a name, and unmasked a predator who thought he had escaped. It was more than justice for one child. It was a warning to every monster still lurking in the shadows. Time was no longer on their side. And for April Marie Tinsley, though her story ended far too soon, Her case became a symbol of sorrow, of resilience, and of the power of science to drag even the darkest secrets into the light. Today, April Tinsley's story is remembered not only as one of Indiana's darkest crimes, but also as a defining moment in the evolution of justice. For decades, her killer hid behind the ordinary mask of everyday life, smug in the belief that he was untouchable. He taunted detectives, mocked the community, and dared the world to catch him. To neighbors, he was invisible. To April's family, he was a shadow that refused to die. But shadows cannot last forever. 30 years later, science and determination closed in. The same DNA he once flaunted as a taunt became his undoing. What he left behind in arrogance became the very rope that dragged him into the light. John D. Miller learned too late that time is not protection, and that every secret leaves a trace. Still, for many in Fort Wayne, justice was bittersweet. April's face remains frozen in time. A bright 8-year-old girl with blonde hair and a shy smile, never given the chance to grow up. Her parents aged under the weight of waiting, and the community still carries scars from those 3 days in 1988 when fear eclipsed innocence. Her case stands as both a warning and a beacon. A warning that evil can wear the most ordinary face, live in the most ordinary house, and blend into the most ordinary street. But also a beacon, that even the darkest shadows can eventually be pierced, that the patience of justice may be slow, but it is relentless. In the end, April's story is not only about tragedy, but about memory. The long memory of a city that refused to forget, of investigators who refused to quit, and of a little girl whose name will forever remind the world that evil never truly escapes the reach of justice. If the story stirred something in you, if it made you think about abuse, justice, or the fragile thread that holds families together, then don't let it stop here. Share this story so others can wrestle with it too. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing the stories that challenge comfort and demand we look closer. Then like this video not only because it is pleasant but because justice matters, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. The end. Thank you.